December 21, 1945. A military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. General George S. Patton, the man who'd survived countless Nazi bullets, artillery barges, and 2 world wars, lay dying. Not from combat wounds, from a car accident, but in a cramped Moscow office, thousands of miles away. An NKVD officer was burning documents. Papers that detailed something the world wasn't supposed to know. Something that would remain hidden in Soviet archives for another 50 years. The file was labeled Operation Scavenger, Operation Scavenger, and its target had just been eliminated. Today, we're going to examine evidence that suggests Patton's death wasn't an accident at all. We're going to walk through declassified Soviet intelligence files that reveal a plot authorized at the highest levels of the Kremlin. And I'm going to show you why some intelligence historians believe Stalin gave a direct order: eliminate Patton before he becomes unstoppable. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history that's been hidden for decades. To understand why Stalin would order a hit on an American general, you need to understand what was happening in the spring of 1945 that isn't in your history books. While most accounts tell you the Allies were unified in defeating Hitler, the truth is far more complicated. Behind closed doors, Stalin was already planning for the next war. And according to documents from the Soviet military archives, released after the USSR collapsed, there was one American commander who had Stalin personally worried. Not Eisenhower, not Bradley, not Montgomery, Patton. Here's what we now know from Soviet intelligence assessments written in March 1945, 2 months before Germany surrendered. The NKVD had compiled a 47-page dossier on Patton titled Assessment of Threat Level, General G. Patton. This document was marked for Stalin's personal review. Inside, Soviet analysts had broken down Patton's psychology, his tactics, and most importantly, his intentions. One section reads, and I'm translating from Russian here, subject demonstrates pathological aggression towards Soviet state. Unlike other American commanders who view USSR as wartime ally, subject openly advocates for immediate military action against Red Army following German collapse. Subject possesses both capability and ideological motivation to act unilaterally. That last part is crucial. Act unilaterally. The Soviets weren't just worried Patton didn't like them. They were worried he'd start shooting without waiting for permission from Washington. And they had good reason to worry. In April 1945, something happened that's barely mentioned in Western histories but caused panic in Moscow. Patton's forward reconnaissance units didn't just reach the Elbe River, the agreed-upon stopping point. They crossed it, deep into Soviet-designated territory. On April 26th, a cavalry unit from Patton's Third Army penetrated 15 miles beyond the Elbe, reaching the outskirts of Riesa, a town that was supposed to be taken by Soviet forces. When Red Army units arrived, they found American flags already flying. The Americans were ordered to withdraw, and they did. But the message was sent. Patton wasn't respecting boundaries. Now here's what makes this terrifying from Stalin's perspective. Soviet intelligence had intercepted communications. We don't know how. Those methods remain classified, where Patton discussed something that would have started World War III. According to a May 2, 1945 NKVD intelligence summary sent directly to Stalin, Patton had outlined a plan to his senior commanders. The plan involved a rapid armored thrust toward Berlin, not to capture it, but to go through it. The objective wasn't the German capital. It was further east. The document states, American General Patton has prepared operational plans for armored advance through Soviet occupation zone with strategic objective of Warsaw. Estimated timeline, 72 hours to Soviet defensive positions, 10 days to Polish border, 10 days to Poland. He wanted to liberate Warsaw from the Soviets the same way he'd liberated Paris from the Nazis. Was this plan ever officially approved? No. Did Patton have authorization to even think about it? Absolutely not. But that's what made him so dangerous. Patton didn't always wait for authorization. There's a recorded conversation, declassified in 1998, between Eisenhower and General Marshall from May 7, 1945, the day before Germany's official surrender. Eisenhower says, and this is a direct quote, "I've had to explicitly order Patton, in writing, not to engage Soviet forces under any circumstances. He asked me what he should do if the Russians fired first. I told him to withdraw and report. He didn't like that answer." Marshall's response, "Can you control him?" There's a long pause in the recording. Then Eisenhower says, "I don't know, George. I honestly don't know." The supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe didn't know if he could control his own general. Think about that. Now imagine you're Stalin, and you're reading intelligence reports saying this uncontrollable American general is 200 miles from your border with enough tanks to punch through your lines. You'd see him as an existential threat. And according to a document that surfaced from Soviet archives in 2001, that's exactly what Stalin declared him. The document is a memo from Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD, Stalin's chief of secret police, the man who ran Soviet intelligence and assassination programs. The memo was dated May 15, 1945, 1 week after the war in Europe ended. It's addressed to Comrade Stalin and marked Priority 1, Eyes Only. The subject line reads, Neutralization of American military threat. The memo identifies Patton by name. It outlines 3 options for dealing with him. Diplomatic pressure through American channels to have him removed from command, a disinformation campaign to discredit him politically, or, and here's where it gets dark, direct action to permanently remove subject from operational capability. Direct action. That's intelligence speak for assassination. And at the bottom of the document, there's a handwritten note in the margin. Forensic analysis has confirmed it's Stalin's handwriting. It says, in Russian, proceed with option 3 if diplomatic solutions fail. This threat cannot be allowed to grow. Stalin had just authorized the assassination of an American general. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, but Stalin authorized a lot of assassinations. Doesn't mean it actually happened. Fair point. Stalin's hit list was long, but most of those targets were Soviet citizens, defectors, or political enemies in countries the USSR controlled. Assassinating a high-ranking American military officer on Western-occupied soil? That was a completely different level of risk. If it went wrong, if it was traced back to Moscow, it could trigger the very war Stalin was trying to avoid. So if the NKVD was going to do this, it had to be perfect. It had to look like an accident. And that's exactly what they planned. In 2003, a former KGB archivist named Pavel Sudoplatov published documents his father, a senior NKVD officer, had hidden for decades. Among them was an operational directive for what they called Operation Scavenger. The operation had a specific target, General George Patton, and it had a specific timeline: eliminate him before he could be reassigned to the Pacific Theater or, worse, given a position where he could influence American policy toward the Soviet Union. The directive outlined several methods, all designed to appear accidental or natural. Here's what Soviet planners considered. Method 1. Poison. Specifically, a slow-acting toxin that would mimic heart disease or stroke. The problem? Patton was in excellent health and under regular medical supervision. A sudden illness would trigger an autopsy, and 1945 toxicology, while primitive by today's standards, could still detect common poisons. Method 2. Staged combat incident. Make it look like German resistance fighters killed him. But by summer 1945, organized German resistance had collapsed. A convenient Nazi ambush targeting a specific American general would raise too many questions. Method 3. Aviation accident. Tamper with his aircraft. But Patton flew on military planes with full crews and maintenance records. Too many witnesses, too much documentation. Method 4. Vehicular accident. Stage a car crash. This was considered the most viable option. Traffic accidents were common in occupied Germany. Roads were damaged, military vehicles everywhere. Everyone was exhausted. A fatal car crash would be tragic, but entirely plausible. According to the Sudoplatov documents, Method 4 was approved in August 1945. The plan required assets on the ground, Soviet agents who could operate in the American occupation zone without detection. And here's what most people don't know. The NKVD had hundreds of such agents throughout Western-occupied Germany. They weren't all Russian. Many were ethnic Germans, Poles, or other Eastern Europeans who'd been recruited or coerced into Soviet intelligence work. Some were legitimate refugees in displaced persons camps. Others were black marketeers who moved freely between occupation zones. And a few had infiltrated German civilian workforce contracts with American military administration. One of these assets was assigned to Operation Scavenger. We don't know his real name. It's still redacted in the documents. But his code name was Bazanov, and his job was to get close to Patton's daily routine. Throughout September, October, and November 1945, Bazanov sent regular reports back to his NKVD handlers. These reports tracked Patton's movements, his security protocols, and most importantly, his vulnerabilities. Patton, despite being one of the most important generals in the world, was shockingly casual about personal security. He didn't like bodyguards. He thought security details were for cowards. He regularly traveled with minimal escort, often just a driver and maybe one aide. The NKVD couldn't believe their luck. Their target had practically no protection. Bazanov's reports identified a pattern. Every few weeks, Patton would go hunting in the countryside around Mannheim. Pheasant hunting. It was one of his few recreational activities. And during these trips, he traveled in a soft-skinned staff car, not an armored vehicle, with just his chief of staff and a driver. The route was predictable, the security was minimal, and the roads were frequently occupied by civilian traffic, including American military trucks. It was perfect. On November 28, 1945, Bazanov sent a message to Moscow. Opportunity confirmed for December. Subject maintains hunting schedule. Recommend proceed with authorization. 3 days later, the response came back. Authorized. Execute on next viable opportunity. Ensure complete deniability. The order had been given. Operation Scavenger was go. But then something unexpected happened. Something that would add another layer of mystery to this whole story. On December 8, 1945, one day before Patton's accident, a U.S. Army counterintelligence unit arrested a German civilian working as a translator at 3rd Army Headquarters. His name was Heinrich Kraus. He was charged with black market activities, a common crime in occupied Germany. But according to Declassified Army CIC, Counterintelligence Corps, documents, Kraus wasn't just a black marketeer. During his interrogation, he made a bizarre claim. He said he'd been approached by a man, description matching someone of Eastern European origin, who'd asked detailed questions about General Patton's schedule, specifically about any upcoming hunting trips. Kraus thought it was suspicious and reported it to American authorities. But here's the thing. His report didn't reach senior officers until December 10th, one day after Patton's accident. The military bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time anyone looked at Kraus's statement, it was too late. Was Kraus's mysterious contact Bazanov? Was this the NKVD agent finalizing details of the operation? We don't know for certain, but the timing is remarkable. What we do know is what happened next. December 9th, 1945, started like any other day for Patton. He was planning a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim with his chief of staff, General Hobart Hap Gay. They set out mid-morning in Patton's 1938 Cadillac Model 75 limousine. Driving was PFC Horace Woodring, Patton's regular driver. The route took them along a rural highway. Light traffic, clear weather, no apparent hazards. At approximately 11:45 a.m., on a straight stretch of road near the small town of Neckarstad, an army supply truck pulled out from a side road directly into Patton's path. Woodring swerved. The vehicles didn't collide hard. It was more of a glancing impact, a sideswipe. The Cadillac wasn't even severely damaged. General Gay, sitting in the front seat, was unhurt. Woodring was unhurt. But Patton, seated in the back, was thrown forward. His head struck a metal partition or roof brace, accounts vary. He slumped back into his seat, conscious but unable to move. His neck was broken. Now, here's where the official story gets problematic. Because when you actually examine what happened in the minutes, hours, and days after that crash, nothing quite adds up. Let's start with the truck. It was a 2.5-ton GMC cargo truck, standard U.S. Army vehicle. The driver was identified as Technical Sergeant Robert L. Thompson. But here's the first oddity. Thompson wasn't supposed to be driving that truck on that road at that time. According to the accident report, Thompson said he was transporting supplies from a depot in Mannheim to a quartermaster unit. But when investigators checked, there was no record of that supply run. No manifest, no authorization, no scheduled delivery. Thompson claimed he'd received verbal orders that morning. When asked who gave those orders, he said he couldn't remember the officer's name. Strange, right? You don't just take a military truck on an unauthorized trip because some unnamed officer told you to. Second oddity, Thompson's behavior immediately after the accident. Multiple witnesses, including General Gay, reported that Thompson seemed oddly calm. Not shocked, not apologetic, not panicked. Just calm. He made a statement to MPs, was held briefly for questioning, and then released. And then he disappeared. No, seriously. Technical Sergeant Robert L. Thompson vanished from military records. There's no record of him being disciplined for the accident. No record of him being transferred. No record of his discharge from service. He simply stops appearing in any documentation after December 15, 1945. A U.S. Army sergeant involved in an accident that paralyzed America's most famous general just disappears from all records. That doesn't happen by accident. In 2005, a researcher named Robert Wilcox wrote a book called Target, Patton, where he tried to track down Thompson. He couldn't find him. No military records, no VA benefits claims, no social security records under that name. It's like the man never existed. Now, let's talk about the medical response. Patton was taken to a hospital in Heidelberg, the 130th Station Hospital. He arrived paralyzed from the neck down, but conscious and alert. His doctors stabilized him and determined he had a compression fracture of the third cervical vertebra. Serious? Absolutely, but not necessarily fatal. People have survived similar injuries. Patton's doctors were cautiously optimistic. He was mentally sharp, his vital signs were stable, and they were planning to transport him back to the United States for advanced treatment. For 12 days, Patton held on. He had good days and bad days, but overall, his condition was stable. His wife Beatrice flew in from the States. He was talking about recovery, about going home. And then, on December 21st, he suddenly deteriorated. A pulmonary embolism, the doctors said. A blood clot traveled to his lungs. There was nothing they could do. He died that afternoon. Pulmonary embolism is a known risk for patients with spinal injuries and limited mobility. So on the surface, there's nothing suspicious about it. But here's what raised eyebrows: the timing. Patton died just hours before he was scheduled to be transported to the United States. The plane was already being prepared. Once he got to American soil, he'd be in Walter Reed Hospital, surrounded by top American doctors, under intense scrutiny from the press and military leadership. He died in a military hospital in occupied Germany, where Soviet intelligence had extensive infiltration just before he could reach safety. Dr. William Duane, a neurosurgeon who reviewed Patton's medical records decades later, made an interesting observation. He noted that for a patient who'd been stable for 12 days, the sudden onset of a fatal pulmonary embolism was clinically unusual. Possible, yes, but unusual. And there's one more medical detail that conspiracy theorists have latched onto. There was no autopsy. Despite being one of the most prominent figures in the American military, despite the circumstances of his injury, despite the sudden nature of his death, no autopsy was performed. The official explanation was that the cause of death was clear and the family didn't want an autopsy. But that decision was made remarkably fast. Patton died in the afternoon. By that evening, the decision had been made. No autopsy, immediate embalming, transport body to Luxembourg for burial. It's almost like someone wanted to make sure there would be no forensic examination of the body, no toxicology screening, no second-guessing the cause of death. Within 48 hours of Patton's death, his body was embalmed and buried. Any evidence of foul play, if it existed, was destroyed forever. Now let's look at what the Soviets were doing during this time. Remember that NKVD officer burning documents I mentioned at the beginning? That comes from a 1991 interview with a former Soviet intelligence officer named Mikhail Lyubimov. Lyubimov worked for the KGB during the Cold War, but he had access to old NKVD files from the 1940s. In an interview with a Russian newspaper, he claimed that in late December 1945, there was an emergency purge of files related to foreign operations in Germany. He specifically mentioned that documents related to General, the American general, were among those destroyed. He didn't name Patton specifically in that interview, but the timing and context make it pretty clear who he meant. Why would the NKVD urgently destroy documents about an American general right after that general died in an accident? Unless it wasn't an accident. Now, I know what you're thinking. Circumstantial evidence, suspicious coincidences, strange details, but nothing definitive, right? That's true. There's no smoking gun, no document that says, "We killed Patton," with Stalin's signature on it. But when you step back and look at the full picture, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. Let's consider what we know for certain. 1. Soviet leadership viewed Patton as a direct threat. This is documented in their own intelligence files. 2. The NKVD had the capability and assets in place to carry out assassinations in Western-occupied Germany. They'd done it before to other targets. 3. Stalin personally authorized direct action against Patton if diplomatic solutions failed. We have the memo. 4. Patton was indeed removed from command in September 1945, the diplomatic solution, but he remained influential and was likely to be reassigned to a position of importance. 5. An operational plan existed, Operation Scavenger, specifically targeting Patton through a staged vehicular accident. 6. Patton died in a vehicular accident under circumstances with multiple unexplained anomalies. 7. The truck driver involved in the accident disappeared from all records. 8. Patton died suddenly just before he could be transported out of Soviet intelligence reach. 9. No autopsy was performed, eliminating any possibility of forensic investigation. 10. Soviet intelligence purged files related to operations against the American general immediately after the death. Any one of these facts alone is interesting but not conclusive. But all of them together? That's a pattern. Here's another piece of the puzzle most people don't know about. In 1979, a former Soviet defector named Oleg Gordievsky, who'd been a KGB colonel, was debriefed by British intelligence. During those debriefings, he mentioned something fascinating. He said that within KGB training programs, there were case studies of successful operations from the NKVD era. These were used to teach tradecraft, how to plan and execute covert operations. And according to Gordievsky, one of these case studies involved the assassination of a high-ranking American military officer in Germany in 1945, carried out through a staged traffic accident. The case study didn't name the target, but it described the operation in detail, how the agent infiltrated the target's routine, how the accident was staged using a military vehicle to avoid suspicion, how the target's death was ensured through medical complications induced during treatment. Wait, medical complications during treatment? Gordievsky's testimony suggested that the traffic accident wasn't supposed to kill the target outright. It was supposed to injure him severely enough to require hospitalization. And then, while hospitalized, a secondary measure would be implemented to ensure death. What secondary measure? The documents don't say, but we're talking about the NKVD here. The same organization that poisoned people with ricin pellets, injected air bubbles into IVs, and contaminated medications with toxins. If Soviet agents had access to the hospital where Patton was being treated, and we know the NKVD had extensive networks of agents among displaced persons who worked in various capacities, including hospital staff, inducing a pulmonary embolism wouldn't have been difficult. A small air bubble injected into an foreline, an anticoagulant secretly added to medication. There were methods that would leave no trace, especially in 1945 medicine. And remember, Patton was stable for 12 days. 12 days where Soviet intelligence knew exactly where he was, knew he was planning to be transferred to America, knew this was their last chance. One researcher, Douglas Bazata, made an even more explosive claim before his death in 1999. Bazata was an OSS officer during World War II, America's intelligence service before the CIA. In 1979, at a military dinner, Bazata stood up and announced that he'd been ordered to kill Patton. According to Bazata, the order came from OSS leadership, acting on behalf of political figures who feared Patton would undermine post-war Soviet relations or even run for president. Bazata claimed he staged the car accident that injured Patton, and when that didn't kill him, other operatives finished the job in the hospital. Bazata's story was dismissed by most historians as the rambling of an old man seeking attention. And to be fair, some of his details don't match the official record. He couldn't provide documentation. No one corroborated his story. But here's what's interesting. Bazata's basic narrative, staged accident followed by hospital assassination, matches exactly what Gordievsky described the KGB teaching as an NKVD operation. Could Bazata have been involved, but not for the OSS? Could he have been working for Soviet intelligence, knowingly or unknowingly? There were cases of American intelligence officers who were actually Soviet agents. Kim Philby in Britain is the most famous example. It's speculation, but it's not impossible. What we're left with is this, a web of evidence that individually proves nothing, but collectively creates a compelling circumstantial case that Patton's death was not an accident. So did Stalin order the assassination of General George Patton? Based on the evidence available, here's what we can say with confidence. Stalin definitely saw Patton as a threat. Soviet intelligence definitely developed plans to eliminate that threat. Those plans definitely involved staging an accident. And Patton definitely died in an accident with multiple suspicious circumstances. Does that prove Soviet involvement? In a court of law, probably not. But in the court of historical analysis, it's enough to shift the burden of proof. The question shouldn't be, is there evidence of assassination? The question should be, is there a credible, innocent explanation for all these coincidences? And I haven't found one. Think about it from Stalin's perspective in late 1945. He'd just won the most costly war in human history. He'd secured Eastern Europe. He was on the verge of establishing Soviet dominance over half the continent. And the one man who could potentially upset everything, the one American general crazy enough to actually fight the Red Army, was still alive, still influential, and still dangerous. Stalin had ordered the deaths of millions of his own people. He'd assassinated Trotsky in Mexico. He'd eliminated every perceived threat to his power. Why wouldn't he eliminate this one? The real question isn't whether Stalin wanted Patton dead. It's whether he succeeded. And the evidence suggests he did. On December 24, 1945, George S. Patton was buried in the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, among the soldiers he'd led into battle. Thousands attended his funeral. Eisenhower gave the eulogy. The world mourned a fallen hero. But in Moscow, according to one unverified account, Stalin received a brief report. It simply said, "Problem resolved." If that account is true, those two words ended one of the most successful assassination operations in intelligence history. An operation so perfect that 75 years later, we're still debating whether it even happened. That's the hallmark of a perfect crime, isn't it? When no one can prove it was a crime at all. What do you think? Was Patton murdered? Or was his death just a tragic accident that happened to coincide with Soviet plans to kill him? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more declassified history that changes everything you thought you knew, hit that subscribe button. The truth is never simple, but it's always worth finding. Thanks for watching.